In that year, the beginning of 2015, Paulo Montiel was at the peak of his business success. At 45 years old, he was a man of average height, with carefully combed-back graying hair, eyes that always seemed to be calculating something, and he wore suits that, although discreet, did not hide the exclusivity of the fabric. He had just closed a major deal for the construction of yet another luxurious development in the west zone of the city. He believed that life was nothing more than a great game of power, where money dictated the rules, and he felt completely in control. That particular late afternoon, seated in his spacious office on the 17th floor of a luxurious commercial building, he admired the panoramic view of the city while sipping a dose of aged whiskey, never imagining that in just a few minutes his life would change drastically. The phone rang abruptly, shattering the room's comfortable silence. When he answered, the voice of his assistant, normally calm and professional, sounded trembling, almost hesitant. "Mr. Montiel, the hospital called. It's about Miguel." In a matter of seconds, the comfort and security he felt crumbled in the face of the news. His son, Miguel, only 12 years old, had suffered a severe accident at school and was unconscious. Paulo's mind immediately went on high alert. His glass slipped from his hand, shattering on the floor with a dull noise. And for the first time in many years, he felt completely vulnerable, powerless in the face of something that his money and influence could not solve. Without hesitation, he rushed out towards the hospital, not imagining that the real challenge of his life was only just beginning. Upon arriving at the hospital, Paulo was met with a scene he would never forget. Hurried doctors, nurses with worried looks, blinding fluorescent lights that gave the corridors an impersonal coldness. The characteristic smell of antiseptics seemed to intensify his anxiety even further. Accustomed to order, control, and certainties, at that moment, Paulo felt disoriented, as if he were being sucked into a nightmare from which he couldn't wake. When he found Miguel in the ICU bed, surrounded by machines whose intermittent sounds echoed like a hammer against his head, an unprecedented anguish took hold of his chest. Seeing him there, motionless, his once familiar face now pale and vulnerable, brought him a bitter sense of impotence that money could not dispel. He tried to find some sign of comfort in the doctor's technical words, but their serious and evasive expressions betrayed the gravity of the case. Days passed, soon turning into weeks and then months. Time seemed frozen for Paulo, whose routine now amounted to long hours sitting on an uncomfortable hospital room sofa waiting for any sign of improvement from his son. He could no longer take an interest in his business, refused important meetings, neglected phone calls, and left critical decisions pending, much to the despair of his assistants. Every morning, upon entering the softly lit, almost melancholic room, he faced Miguel, lying motionless, connected to tubes and machines, with his eyes closed and a serene expression, as if he were sleeping deeply. As he held his small, warm hand, he relived shared moments, like the soccer matches in the backyard on Sundays, when Miguel ran barefoot on the freshly cut grass, laughing loudly while celebrating every goal. Those memories now hurt deeply, intensifying the sense of emptiness that overwhelmed him. Paulo, a man who controlled the fate of so many people through his decisions, discovered with sadness and despair that he could not control what mattered most: his son's life. That specific night, in mid-July, a fierce storm battered the city, further intensifying the gloomy feeling that was taking over Paulo. Seated in an uncomfortable chair, one he had come to know intimately after so many sleepless nights at the hospital, he felt every muscle in his body aching from accumulated tension. The room was silent, except for the soft, rhythmic sound of the machines attached to fragile Miguel's body. Paulo stared fixedly at his son's face, trying in vain to detect any sign of improvement. Then he heard an unusual noise coming from the corridor. Excited voices, quick and determined footsteps, accompanied by the distressed voice of nurses calling for calm. Before he could react, the door swung open abruptly, revealing a slight girl with tanned skin and short, disheveled brown hair, which contrasted with her large, deeply dark eyes. She entered determinedly, barefoot, and wearing clothes too worn for the cold of that rainy night. The girl, whom Paulo would later learn was named Lupita, seemed unconcerned by the staff's protests, who tried in vain to prevent her from advancing toward the bed where Miguel lay motionless. With a determination that surprised, given her apparent fragility, Lupita stopped by the boy's bedside and murmured some words that no one that could clearly understand. Paulo watched the scene in perplexity, torn between immediately expelling the girl or letting something inside him, an almost forgotten hope, make room for the unexpected. It was then that Lupita gently placed her hand on Miguel's forehead and began to recite a prayer, simple and sincere, in a low, almost inaudible voice. At first it seemed like merely a symbolic gesture, without practical meaning, but something strange began to happen at that very moment. Miguel's heart monitors, once so regular and monotonous, began to show fluctuations. Paulo felt his heart race as a nurse ran to call the doctors. Looking again at Lupita, he noticed tears silently streaming down her face. Despite being so young and seemingly fragile, she exuded an extraordinary strength and a serenity that defied any medical or business logic. When the doctors entered the room, they found an entirely unlikely scenario. Miguel, after months without any sign of reaction, was slightly moving his fingers on both hands and feet, as if he were slowly awakening from a long sleep. Paulo, astonished, could barely process what he saw before his eyes. It was as if the world had slowed down around him, and he could only focus on his son's small hand, moving gently beneath the white hospital sheet. The medical team immediately began conducting a series of tests, checking the machines and conversing among themselves in hushed voices, as if they were afraid to break the magical moment occurring there. Lupita, still standing by the bed, remained still, watching everything with serene eyes, filled with a confidence that seemed absurd for a child so young and visibly worn down by life. Paulo slowly approached her, feeling for the first time a complex mixture of gratitude, curiosity, and genuine respect for that unknown girl. But Lupita did not seem interested in recognition or thanks. Instead, her gaze, which had been firm and determined until then, quickly turned into a plea. With a trembling, soft voice, as if afraid to cause any disturbance, she looked up at Paulo with dark eyes full of urgency and asked, in a tone mixing faith and despair, "Please, sir, help my brother Rafael. He's worse off than Miguel and needs urgent help." Paulo felt his heart tighten at that unexpected request. For a moment, his skeptical businessman instinct spoke up. Who was this child? What brother was this? And why should he help them specifically? But before he could articulate any question, Lupita extended a small, crumpled photograph toward him. Looking at the image, already worn by time and the difficult circumstances the girl lived in, Paulo felt something inside him break. In the photo, a small, smiling boy was embracing Lupita in front of a modest shack. The innocent look of that child brought a tightness to his chest and an unexpected urgency to find out who these children were and what they had to do with his life. Paulo spent the following hours in deep unrest. Lupita's simple, direct request kept hammering at his mind while he observed Miguel, now under constant medical surveillance. His son, although showing clear signs of improvement, still remained in a delicate state, and Paulo was afraid to be away from him even for a few minutes. Yet the girl's insistence and that innocent face in the photograph would not let him rest. For the first time in a long while, Paulo found himself torn between the duty to stay by his son's side and a growing sense of responsibility for these unknown children. Amid that emotional whirlwind, he realized that perhaps Lupita's desperate plea was not just a coincidence. Determined to investigate further, Paulo called one of his closest advisors and discreetly ordered him to gather everything he could find about the girl and her brother Rafael. Hours later, well into the early morning, the advisor returned with information that transformed Paulo's initial discomfort into profound shock. In Paulo's hands were old documents, forgotten reports, and accounts of displaced families from years earlier when one of his business decisions had led to the demolition of a humble residential complex to make way for a luxury condominium. Among the displaced families was Josefina Ortiz, Lupita and Rafael's mother, who, after losing her home, could not withstand the ensuing hardships and passed away shortly after. Paulo felt as if the ground had been ripped out from under him as he read those words, as if someone had pulled the floor from beneath his feet. For the first time in his life, he saw himself directly responsible for something deeper and more painful than financial losses or material damages. His cold, rational decision, based solely on numbers and profit, had destroyed that family's life and thrown two defenseless children out onto the streets. Feeling crushed by guilt, Paulo understood that he could no longer ignore that brave girl's plea, which had unexpectedly entered his life, bringing a harsh, inescapable truth. In the early hours of the following morning, Paulo again found himself before little Lupita, who waited patiently in the hospital corridor, seated on a hard bench, her feet dirty from the earth and swinging slowly in the air. Noticing his approach, she raised her face with anxiety, looking at him with those deep, hopeful eyes. Now, aware of the devastating role he had played in her family's tragedy, Paulo felt uncomfortable, almost unworthy, to look her directly in the eyes. Taking a deep breath, he bent down to be at her level, and with a gentleness that until then had been rare in him, asked about Rafael and how he could help. Lupita, visibly moved to finally be heard, began to describe in detail the desperate situation they had been living in since their mother's loss. They slept under awnings, depended on the charity of strangers, and faced street violence daily. With a choked voice, she explained that Rafael had grown gravely ill weeks ago, presenting constant fevers and worsening respiratory difficulties with each passing day. While listening to that devastating account, Paulo felt a wave of shame and remorse flood his chest. He had never imagined that his business decisions, made with such conviction and arrogance, could affect real, innocent, defenseless people so directly. At that moment, looking at Lupita, he no longer saw just an unknown girl, but someone whose pain he himself had caused. Determined to act quickly, Paulo ordered his employees to immediately locate Rafael and arrange his urgent transfer to the hospital. Lupita, seeing the sincerity in those words, let her tears fall freely, relieved to finally have found someone willing to listen and help. Overcome by an emotion he had never experienced before, Paulo realized that that unlikely encounter might be the chance to repair, at least partially, the errors of the past. For the first time in many years, he felt that the money and power he had accumulated could serve something truly significant, something far beyond mere ostentation or personal profit. Paulo did not have to wait long to see Rafael arrive at the hospital, carefully carried by one of his closest employees. The boy was visibly weak, with a fragile and depleted appearance, almost unrecognizable compared to the smiling child in the photo Lupita had handed him the previous night. Rafael, who appeared to be around 7 years old, had a pale, drawn face, half-closed eyes from a high fever, and trembled slightly as he struggled to breathe. Paulo watched the scene with anguish, feeling that same uncomfortable tightness in his chest he had experienced when he saw his son in that hospital bed. Within minutes, the boy was sent for detailed examinations and immediate treatments, while Lupita, clutching Paulo's hand, watched everything with a mixture of relief and apprehension. For the first time, Paulo realized that he was holding that girl's hand firmly, not only to comfort her, but also to anchor himself amidst the emotional turmoil he was facing. As he waited for medical news about Rafael and Miguel, Paulo was surprised to notice how quickly the children had carved out a space in his thoughts, previously dominated only by figures, contracts, and business strategies. Watching Lupita, who now slept exhausted on a hospital sofa, he felt an unexpected impulse to protect her, as if that simple gesture could redeem a fraction of the pain he had caused. Gradually, he began to reflect on his life, analyzing the countless decisions he had made over the years, always justified by necessity, efficiency, and profit above all else. For the first time, he questioned deeply his motivations and the true value of the power he had conquered. It was strange how that barefoot girl, literally coming from the streets, managed to awaken in him a conscience that no lecture, advice, or tough negotiation had ever achieved. Still without definitive answers about the future, Paulo felt his life taking a new and irreversible turn, something that both frightened and fascinated him at the same time. During the following days, the hospital practically became the home for Paulo, Lupita, and the two boys. Each morning arrived laden with hope and fear as he anxiously awaited the medical reports on Rafael and Miguel. Rafael's condition, despite the initial gravity, was slowly beginning to improve, responding positively to the intensive treatments. Meanwhile, Miguel, though still drowsy and confused, was showing increasingly frequent signs of consciousness, moving the entire medical team who had accompanied his arduous journey thus far. Paulo found himself torn between the joy of his son's improvement and the constant worry for Rafael, whose condition still required special care. In that turbulent period, Lupita became a constant and reassuring presence for him. Despite her young age, she displayed an uncommon maturity, offering words of support that often surprised him with their profound wisdom. Paulo had never imagined that he could find comfort and strength precisely in a child, especially in a girl he had indirectly helped place in that situation. One calm afternoon, while Miguel rested, Paulo sat next to Lupita in the hospital's indoor garden, under the cool shade of a leafy tree. Around them, relatives of other patients spoke quietly, as if respecting that small space of tranquility amid the chaos of the wards. After a few minutes of comfortable silence, Paulo looked at Lupita and asked, with sincere interest, how she had found the strength to carry on after losing her mother and facing so many hardships on the streets. Lupita stared at him with a calm yet deeply serious expression and answered with a disarming simplicity, "My mother always used to say that when you believe very strongly in something good, it helps keep the bad things away." Paulo felt a lump form in his throat at that so direct and genuine answer. He, who had always trusted only his own power and money, began to understand that true strength might lie precisely in that unshakable innocence and the simple faith Lupita carried within her, even after everything she had endured. The next morning, while Paulo was having breakfast in the hospital's quiet cafeteria, his phone rang insistently, breaking the momentary tranquility he had managed to reach after so long. Upon answering, he heard a familiar voice, though strangely agitated. It was Fernando, his younger brother, known for being discreet and reserved, almost always staying distant from the family's personal matters. Paulo found the anxious tone of the call odd, especially when Fernando asked, in a low and nervous voice, if Miguel had completely woken up and remembered anything about the accident. Feeling sudden discomfort at that unexpected question, Paulo assured his brother that the boy was still confused and without clear memories. After hanging up, an uneasy feeling took over him. It was too strange that sudden interest, especially coming from someone like Fernando, who was always so emotionally detached from family matters. That call would not leave Paulo's mind throughout the day. As the hours passed, a strange feeling began to disturb him, bringing forth a suspicion he did not want to accept. He tried to dismiss those thoughts, attributing them to the tension accumulated over the past weeks, but something deep within his mind remained restless, like an insistent voice that would not let him be at peace. That night, after confirming that Miguel and Rafael were well and resting peacefully, Paulo decided to take a solitary walk around the hospital, trying to calm his thoughts. As he passed near Miguel's room, he noticed Lupita intently watching the boy through the glass door. Seeing him approach, the girl hesitated for a moment, but then, with a firm and confident voice of someone who had kept an important secret, she said, "You know, Mr. Paulo, I think it wasn't an accident. I saw someone at the school near the stairs on the day Miguel fell. I didn't speak up before because I was scared, but I think someone pushed him." Paulo felt an intense chill run down his spine at those unexpected words from Lupita, realizing that what she had just revealed could change everything he thought he knew about his son's accident. Paulo felt as if the ground had disappeared from under his feet upon hearing those unexpected words from Lupita. Images of the day he received the accident. News flooded back to his memory immediately. Now accompanied by a growing sense of panic, he struggled to maintain calm in front of the girl, breathing deeply while trying to organize his thoughts. Carefully, he asked Lupita if she could describe better who she had seen near the stairs that day. Lupita lowered her eyes, thoughtful, trying to recover that difficult memory. After a brief silence, she raised her face and, in a low voice, confessed that she couldn't see the person's face clearly, but she distinctly remembered that it was a tall man, dressed in dark, elegant clothes, unlike the people who usually roamed the school. Paulo felt a chill run through his body, accompanied by a sensation of nausea. That description fit Fernando perfectly, his own brother. Throughout that night, Paulo couldn't sleep. Dominated by a growing unease, his mind refused to accept that someone so close could have been capable of something so monstrous. But the more he mentally replayed the conversation, with Lupita and Fernando's strange call, the more fear turned into a painful certainty. He then decided that he needed to investigate this possibility personally before taking any rash action. In the morning, while Miguel and Rafael still slept, Paulo requested access to the company's security cameras, carefully reviewing the footage from the days preceding the accident. His attention was soon captured by a specific recording. Fernando was seen entering his office furtively, nervously rifling through documents stored in a locked drawer. With his heart racing, Paulo remembered that Miguel, a few days before his fall, had spent some afternoons playing alone precisely in that office. Now all those loose pieces began to form a disturbing picture, revealing a painful truth that Paulo had never imagined facing. Throughout that morning, while reviewing various images and documents, Paulo was overcome by a profound feeling of betrayal and disgust. Fernando was not only his brother, he was someone he had trusted completely, someone with whom he had shared dreams and responsibilities since youth, after the premature death of their parents. Realizing that the person closest to him might be responsible for the tragedy that befell Miguel, his world crumbled once again. Paulo felt physically sick as he confronted those painful proofs, each image reinforcing his certainty. He needed to confront Fernando directly, to hear what he had to say, even knowing that the truth could destroy him. Even more, driven by a mixture of anger, sadness, and confusion, Paulo called his brother and demanded an immediate meeting at the hospital without revealing anything about his discoveries. Fernando, perhaps sensing the unusual urgency in his brother's voice, agreed without question. When Fernando arrived carrying that cold, impeccable demeanor he always had, Paulo struggled to control his emotions. Even before Fernando could ask why he had been called, Paulo presented Lupita's worn photograph of her and Rafael, mentioning coldly the development that had displaced those families. Fernando instantly turned pale, the mask of calm and security crumbling for a brief moment. Still, he tried to maintain control, denying any responsibility for what had happened, but Paulo continued firmly, showing the security camera footage of Fernando rifling through documents that Miguel had possibly discovered. Under pressure, Fernando finally gave in, confessing with an almost unbelievable coldness that he had tried to silence Miguel because he was afraid of losing everything he had achieved through the illicit businesses he secretly ran. The shock and pain of that revelation hit Paulo with devastating force, like a deep and final dagger to the heart. For the first time, the powerful businessman who thought he controlled everything felt completely unmoored. Paulo remained in absolute silence, staring at Fernando with incredulous eyes, while his brother continued his desperate attempt to deny the accusations. Fernando spoke rapidly, stumbling over his own words, searching for excuses and justifications that made no sense in light of the clear evidence. At that moment, Paulo felt a strong impulse to pounce on his brother, to physically confront him, to make him feel at least a fraction of the pain he had caused. But something held him back, perhaps a mixture of exhaustion and deep sadness, or the painful realization that this was not the real solution to the pain he felt. With an almost frightening calm, Paulo simply asked why Fernando had done it. In a wavering voice, his brother finally admitted, with a disturbing sincerity, that Miguel had found documents proving serious crimes that could ruin the company, destroying years of illegal businesses carefully hidden behind a facade of prosperity and legality. Upon hearing those harsh and definitive words, Paulo felt a deep nausea, not only from personal betrayal, but also from realizing that all the success he had built with so much effort was partially sustained by lies and illegalities committed behind his back. He had never deeply questioned the methods Fernando used behind the scenes, as long as the results were profitable. Now, clearly seeing the irreparable damage caused by his negligence, he felt an overwhelming weight of guilt. Looking up, he noticed for the first time something different in his brother's face. A cold, calculating look, with no trace of real remorse, only discomfort at having been caught. At that moment, Paulo understood that Fernando did not truly regret what he had done to his nephew, but rather regretted being discovered. The shock of that realization was like a violent blow to his conscience, making it clear that the brother he thought he knew no longer existed, if he ever truly existed at all. The air in the room seemed to grow denser with each passing second, as if all the revealed truth was pressing down on Paulo's chest with crushing force. Fernando, realizing that there was no way out, crossed his arms and smirked cynically, as if deep down he still believed he could get away unscathed. "And what are you going to do, Paulo? Denounce me. You know very well that if I fall, I won't fall alone." The threat was out in the open, without any disguise. Fernando was no longer trying to deny or justify his actions. He was simply trying to stay in the game. Paulo felt a muted anger rising within him, a fury he hadn't experienced in a long time. His mind raced in search of an answer, a solution to all of this. He could not simply ignore what his brother had done, but he also knew that the scandal could be destructive not only for the company, but for everyone who depended on it. For a moment, the memory of Miguel, motionless in that hospital bed, took over his thoughts. His son had almost died because of the greed and corruption within his own family. And now, in front of him, was Fernando, cold, calculating, without the slightest trace of remorse. Then Paulo realized that there were no longer any blood or business ties that could justify his hesitation. It was no longer about protecting an empire built over the years. It was about justice, about putting an end to all of it, before more innocents were hurt. Without taking his eyes off his brother, Paulo picked up the phone and made a single call. "I want you to come to the hospital now," he said, without revealing the recipient's identity. Fernando raised his eyebrow, still confident that Paulo wouldn't have the courage to ruin him. But for the first time in his life, Paulo Montiel was no longer playing to win. He was playing to make things right. The wait was short. In less than 20 minutes, 2 men in suits entered the hospital, walking with firm and determined steps. They were federal police agents, summoned by Paulo without Fernando's suspicion. The cynical smile on his brother's face disappeared the moment he saw the badges being displayed. "Mr. Fernando Montiel, you are under arrest for involvement in financial crimes, corruption, and attempted homicide," said one of the agents, in a firm, professional voice. Fernando still tried to react, arrogance battling the growing fear in his eyes. "You're making a mistake, Paulo. he murmured through gritted teeth as the officers handcuffed him. But there was no longer any room for manipulations or threats. The weight of truth was finally falling upon him. Paulo watched silently as his brother was escorted through the hospital corridors, his face now a mix of anger and disbelief. The feeling that took over Paulo was not one of immediate relief, but of deep exhaustion, as if years of illusions and lies had finally collapsed upon his shoulders. He knew that this decision would have immeasurable consequences, but for the first time in a long while, he felt that he was doing the right thing. He took a deep breath and returned to the room where Miguel rested. Upon entering, he found Lupita sitting beside his son's bed, holding his hand as if she somehow knew that something had changed. "Will everything be all right now?" asked the girl, looking at him with her big, hopeful eyes. Paulo hesitated for a second, then nodded. "It will be," he replied, and for the first time, it was not an empty promise. The days that followed were strange for Paulo. With Fernando's shadow no longer looming over him, he felt a mixture of relief and emptiness. The company, now under his absolute command, would need a complete overhaul. But curiously, that was not his main focus. For the first time, business seemed secondary. What really occupied his mind was Miguel, Lupita, and Rafael. He spent most of his time at the hospital, watching Miguel gradually recover, interacting with Lupita, who now saw him not as a distant businessman, but as someone who in some way was a part of her life. Rafael, although still fragile, showed an impressive resilience for a boy who had grown up on the streets. His health improved day by day, and the doctors were already optimistic about his full recovery. But Paulo knew that merely getting them out of the hospital wouldn't be enough. He couldn't simply place them in any shelter and go on with his life. They needed more, something that he, for the first time, wanted to offer without expecting anything in return. It was on a sunny morning, sitting in the hospital's small green area, that he made the definitive decision. He called his legal team and ordered them to do everything necessary to ensure that Lupita and Rafael had a dignified home, not just an apartment or temporary house, but a future. He wanted them to study, to have opportunities, to never again have to wander the streets at the mercy of chance. When he told Lupita the news, she did not respond immediately. She only looked at him silently, as if trying to understand whether he was really serious. Then, after a long moment, she smiled. But it wasn't a smile of euphoria or relief, rather a contained smile, loaded with something that Paulo would only understand later. It was the smile of someone who had learned not to build expectations because life always ended up destroying them. It was at that moment he realized that it wasn't enough to merely promise a better future. He would have to prove every day that he was there to keep his word. The adjustment of Lupita and Rafael to a new reality wasn't instantaneous, and Paulo soon realized that money wouldn't solve everything. He ensured that the siblings were enrolled in a good school, arranged for medical and psychological support for both, but still noticed hesitation in the children's glances. Lupita, although grateful, always seemed to keep one foot back, as if expecting that all of it was temporary. A fleeting kindness that at some point would be withdrawn without explanation. Rafael, still weakened, was more receptive, but carried a silent fear, a reflection of years of abandonment and the struggle for survival. Paulo, accustomed to solving everything efficiently, found himself frustrated, realizing that his presence was not enough to break years of distrust and suffering. It wasn't enough to get them off the streets. He needed to prove that he would not abandon them, that his commitment was real. Miguel was the one who gradually managed to pave the way for that connection. Still recovering, he showed a natural affection for Lupita and Rafael, treating them like longtime friends. With his childlike spontaneity, he asked questions that Paulo would never dare ask. What do you miss most about your mom? Have you ever had a dog? What did you most want to do when you were living on the streets? Those conversations, sometimes naive, sometimes painful, allowed Lupita and Rafael, little by little, to open up. One evening, while they were having dinner together, Rafael looked at Paulo and without any ceremony asked, "Why are you helping us? Do you feel guilty?" The ensuing silence was heavy. Paulo had never explicitly told the children about his connection with their tragedy, but Rafael, as sharp as he was, had already pieced it together. Paulo took a deep breath, set down the cutlery, and sincerely replied, "Yes, but that's not all. I want to do things differently. I want to be here for real." Rafael stared at him for a moment and then gave a slight nod. He said nothing more, but in that small gesture, Paulo knew he was on the right path. Time passed, and the coexistence among Paulo, Miguel, Lupita, and Rafael began to feel more natural. What had once been a gesture of reparation turned into a real bond, slowly built without haste. Paulo, who had always prided himself on being a man of quick results and immediate solutions, learned that some things needed time. The siblings still bore scars, and so did he. The difference was that now he was no longer trying to solve everything practically, but simply to be present. When Rafael experienced a relapse in his health, Paulo stayed by his side, holding his hand and ensuring that he wouldn't be alone. When Lupita needed a new uniform for school, he was the one who took her shopping. No secretaries, no intermediaries. They were small gestures, but each one reinforced to the children that he wasn't going anywhere. Then Paulo realized he needed to do something bigger. He couldn't change the past, but he could ensure that other children like Lupita and Rafael wouldn't have to go through the same suffering. The idea came almost naturally, to create a foundation, not just to shelter street children, but to offer a real opportunity for a fresh start. Education, housing, psychological support, and above all, a home. Something different from the cold, bureaucratic shelters he had seen before. He talked with Miguel, Lupita, and Rafael about it, and their reaction was unexpected. Instead of immediate enthusiasm, there was a contemplative silence. Then Lupita, with her characteristic frankness, asked, "Will you be there, or will you just put money in and let someone else take care of it?" The question caught Paulo by surprise, but he didn't need much time to answer. "I'll be there, and so will you if you want to." For the first time, he saw in the girl's eyes something beyond gratitude. He saw trust. Thus, the Novo Amanhã Foundation was born a few months later, the fruit of Paulo's new vision of what really mattered. He invested resources, mobilized his network of contacts, and ensured that the structure was impeccable, but made sure that it was not just a facade philanthropic project. He visited the site regularly, talked with the children, participated in meetings with educators and psychologists, trying to understand what each one needed. Miguel, Lupita, and Rafael became fundamental parts of that process, helping shape the foundation so that it would be, above all, a home for those who had never had one. With every new child welcomed, Paulo felt that he was, in some way, balancing the scales of the past. It was no longer about guilt, but about purpose. But life, as always, would not let things be so simple. Not long after the foundation's inauguration came another blow. Rafael was diagnosed with a serious illness. The doctors were direct. The treatment existed, but it would be long, difficult, and without guarantees. Fear returned with force, bringing back memories of the days of uncertainty by Miguel's bedside. But there was a difference now. Paulo was no longer the same man who had been in that hospital months. Ego, desperate and adrift. He would not run away from that fight, and more importantly, neither would Rafael. Despite the fragility of his health, the boy remained the same resilient child who had survived the streets. When Lupita, for the first time, showed real fear of losing her brother, it was Rafael who held her hand and said, with a calm smile, "We've been through so much, right? This is just another thing." Hearing that, Paulo understood that Rafael was much stronger than anyone had imagined. The following months were a battle. Rafael's treatment required constant trips to the hospital, painful tests, and a patience that, for such a young child, was almost cruel. Yet, even on the hardest days, he refused to give in to despair. Paulo, Miguel, and Lupita were always by his side, accompanying every stage of the process. For the first time in his life, Paulo felt part of something greater than himself. He was no longer just a successful businessman trying to fix past mistakes, but a man who finally understood the true meaning of family. Rafael became a kind of symbol for the foundation, and his struggle mobilized not only those around him, but also many people who began to follow his story. It was Miguel who had the idea to turn that mobilization into something even bigger. He created an awareness campaign about Rafael's illness, using social media, events, and even interviews with the press to publicize the cause. The impact was immediate. People from everywhere began contributing, not only for Rafael's treatment, but also for other children facing the same disease. The Novo Amanhã Foundation's name started spreading, ceasing to be just Paulo Montiel's project to become a movement of hope. Paulo, upon seeing his son leading something so significant, realized that the transformation that had begun months earlier was now beyond his hands. The change wasn't just his, it was everyone's who was around him. Even while fighting for his own life, Rafael became an inspiration, showing that strength was not only in the body, but in the will to continue, even when everything seemed impossible. With the campaign's growth, the Novo Amanhã Foundation began receiving increasing support. Companies started investing in the project, volunteers multiplied, and stories like Rafael's resonated with many other families. Paulo watched it all with a mix of pride and humility. He, who once saw life solely as a game of influence and power, now understood that the real impact came from human connections, genuine care for one another. Yet despite all the progress, the days remained challenging. Rafael experienced ups and downs in his treatment, and Lupita, even though she remained a strong girl, could not hide the fear of losing her brother. Paulo watched her silently, trying to find the right words to comfort her, but he knew that promising everything would be a lie she did not deserve to hear. Then, on one arbitrary night, while everyone was asleep, he found Lupita sitting on the veranda of the house they now called home. Her eyes were fixed on the sky, shining with tears she refused to let fall. Paulo sat beside her without saying a word, just waiting for her to speak when she was ready. After a long silence, Lupita finally murmured, "What if I lose him too?" Paulo felt his heart tighten. Her pain was real, and nothing he said could change that. But then, in a sincere impulse, he answered, "We can't choose what happens, Lupita, but we can choose to be here, together, no matter what comes." This time she did not reply, but allowed herself to lean her head on his shoulder. In that instant, Paulo realized that even without guarantees, the faith she had carried from the beginning was now a part of him too. The following months were a true test for everyone. Rafael continued his treatment, with good days and extremely difficult ones, but he never ceased smiling when he saw Lupita or Miguel by his side. The bond between them became unbreakable, and Paulo, watching closely, understood more and more that the strength of those three did not come from luck or chance, but from the way they supported each other. Amid it all, the Novo Amanhã Foundation grew rapidly. The impact of Rafael's story generated a domino effect, and more children found a home, dignified treatment, and most importantly, a new chance. Paulo got involved in every detail, not because he felt the need to supervise everything, but because he finally understood the purpose of what he was building. His past, once measured in business deals, contracts, and profit margins, now seemed insignificant compared to the lives he was touching. But life, as it always does, didn't allow things to be so simple. Soon after the foundation's inauguration came another blow. Rafael was diagnosed with a serious illness. The doctors were direct. The treatment existed, but it would be long, difficult, and with no guarantees. Fear returned with force, evoking memories of those uncertain days at Miguel's bedside. However, there was a difference now. Paulo was no longer the man who had been at that hospital months ago, desperate and adrift. He would not run away from this fight, and, more importantly, neither would Rafael. Despite his fragile health, the boy continued to be the resilient child who had survived the streets. When Lupita for the first time showed real fear of losing her brother, it was Rafael who held her hand and said, with a calm smile, "We've already been through so much, right? This is just another thing." Hearing that, Paulo understood that Rafael was much stronger than anyone had imagined. The following months were a battle. Rafael's treatment demanded constant trips to the hospital, painful examinations, and a patience that for a child so young was almost cruel. But even on the toughest days, he refused to give in to despair. Paulo, Miguel, and Lupita were always by his side, accompanying every step of the process. For the first time in his life, Paulo felt part of something greater than himself. He was no longer just a successful businessman trying to rectify past mistakes, but a man who finally comprehended the true meaning of family. Rafael became a symbol of the foundation, and his struggle mobilized not only those around him, but also many people who began following his story. It was Miguel who came up with the idea to transform that mobilization into something even bigger. He created an awareness campaign about Rafael's illness, using social media, events, and even interviews with the press to publicize the cause. The impact was immediate. People from all over began to contribute, not only for Rafael's treatment, but also for other children facing the same disease. The Novo Amanhã Foundation's name began to spread, ceasing to be just Paulo Montiel's project and becoming a movement of hope. Paulo, upon seeing his son leading something so significant, realized that the transformation which had begun months ago was now beyond his hands. The change wasn't solely his, it was everyone's who were around him. Even while fighting for his life, Rafael became an inspiration, showing that strength wasn't just in the body, but in the will to continue, even when everything seemed impossible. As the campaign grew, the Novo Amanhã Foundation began receiving more and more support. Companies started investing in the project, volunteers multiplied, and stories like Rafael's resonated with many other families. Paulo watched it all with a mix of pride and humility. He, who once saw life solely as a game of influence and power, now understood that true impact came from human connections, genuine care for one another. Yet despite all the progress, the days remained challenging. Rafael experienced fluctuations in his condition, and Lupita, even though she remained a strong girl, couldn't hide her fear of losing her brother. Paulo observed her silently, trying to find the right words to comfort her, but he knew that promising everything would be a lie she did not deserve to hear. One evening, after dinner with Miguel, Lupita, and Rafael, Paulo noticed something curious. They were laughing and talking about the foundation's future, about plans to expand projects, about the new volunteers arriving. There was no longer any heaviness, no pain, no shadow of the past that once loomed over them, only lightness. At some point, without even realizing it, they had become a true family. Not a family bound by blood, but something even stronger, a family built through love, shared struggles, and the desire to make the world a better place. Paulo smiled, taking a bite while Lupita animatedly discussed with Rafael what the foundation's next big project should be. For the first time in years, he didn't feel the need to be in control. Just being there was enough. Time went on, and the Novo Amanhã Foundation became a symbol of hope and transformation. Paulo, once a man driven solely by ambition and results, now found happiness in watching Miguel, Lupita, and Rafael take the helm of the project with so much passion. They had their own ideas, new approaches, and an energy that he no longer possessed. And that was good. It meant he had fulfilled his mission. One day, during one of the foundation's meetings, Miguel asked if he didn't miss his old life. Paulo only smiled and replied, "I've never felt more alive than I do now." And he knew that was the purest truth. The years went by, and before anyone realized it, the Novo Amanhã Foundation had become much more than just a social project. It wasn't merely a place where children found support. It was a space where lives were rebuilt, where stories gained new chapters. Every year, more and more young people left with a purpose, certain that they were not alone in the world. Lupita, who once entered that hospital as a barefoot, uncertain street girl, now stood out as one of the foundation's leaders. Her story spread, becoming an example of overcoming adversity and resilience. Alongside her, Miguel and Rafael also took on fundamental roles, each contributing in their own way to ensuring the legacy continued to grow. And Paulo, always watching with pride, knew he had made the right choice. But destiny still had a symbolic moment to mark this generational transition. At a special foundation event organized to celebrate the project's 10-year anniversary, Paulo took the stage to do what he had always known would happen: officially hand over command to the young people who had transformed his life. With an emotional look, he handed over the symbolic key of the institution to Miguel, Lupita, and Rafael, who were now ready to carry forward everything they had built together. The audience's applause was deafening, but for Paulo, the true moment of fulfillment came when Lupita, holding the microphone, looked at him and said with the same conviction as years ago, "Faith moves mountains." It was as if a cycle was closing, not with an ending, but with a new beginning, and Paulo, now free from the chains of the past, finally felt at peace. After the ceremony, Paulo remained on stage for a few moments, watching Miguel, Lupita, and Rafael receive the affection of the people who had followed the foundation's journey. There was no sadness in his eyes, nor the emptiness he had imagined feeling when stepping away from command. On the contrary, there was a lightness he had never experienced before. For the first time, he did not need to be in control to feel that he was part of something. His legacy was there, alive, pulsating, growing with every child who found a new path. As he stepped down from the stage, he was surprised by a tight hug from Rafael, who, despite the years and difficulties, still carried the same energy of the resilient boy who had once fought so hard for his life. "Thank you for never giving up on us," he murmured, and Paulo felt the weight of that phrase. It wasn't just about Lupita and Rafael. It was about Miguel, about every child embraced, and above all, about himself. That night, back at home, Paulo sat on the veranda and looked at the sky. The stars shone brightly, as if truly celebrating that moment, just as Lupita used to say. He allowed himself to close his eyes and take a deep breath, feeling the gentle night breeze. He remembered the man he had been before Miguel fell into a coma, before Lupita invaded that hospital and changed everything. It was as if he were looking at a distant stranger. Now his life was different, driven by something much greater than himself. He smiled, not out of pride, but out of gratitude. He picked up the phone and sent a simple message to Lupita. "The stars are shining brighter tonight." Minutes later, he received a short but meaningful reply, "Because you found your way." And in that instant, Paulo knew that regardless of what was yet to come, he would never be lost again. In the days following the ceremony, Paulo experienced a new sensation, that of not needing to race against time. For decades, his life had been driven by urgency, to close deals, expand his company, accumulate achievements. Now, each morning seemed to hold a different meaning. He woke up without the pressure to make decisions affecting thousands of employees, without the weight of million-dollar contracts on his desk. Instead, his day began with small things he would have never noticed before. Fresh coffee on the terrace, daily messages from Miguel and Rafael, Lupita's plans for the foundation. For the first time, he understood the value of time, not as a resource to be managed, but as a gift he could finally enjoy. But, despite the newfound tranquility, Paulo knew his journey was not over. He still had much to do, many stories to help rewrite. Even without being at the helm of the foundation, his presence was still essential. He continued to visit the project, advising young people who arrived without hope, talking with the new team members. One day, while walking through the institution's corridors, he was approached by a little girl of about 6 years old, who was holding a crumpled drawing in her hands. "Are you Paulo?" she asked timidly. He smiled and nodded. "Lupita said you help children, so I did this for you." He took the drawing and saw a child's portrait of a large house surrounded by shining stars. In the corner of the paper, written in uncertain handwriting, it read, "Family." Paulo clutched the paper tightly, feeling a lump in his throat. He no longer needed any confirmation. He was exactly where he was meant to be. That night, Paulo returned home with the drawing carefully folded in his jacket pocket. He sat in his favorite armchair, the same one that once served merely as a resting spot between exhausting meetings and endless negotiations. But now, it was a place where he allowed himself to reflect on everything he had experienced. He reopened the drawing and ran his fingers over the paper, feeling the symbolic weight of those simple yet powerful lines. Family. That word had never held as true a meaning as it did now. For years he believed success meant power, influence, money. But what he had achieved there, with Miguel, Lupita, Rafael, and so many other children, was infinitely greater than any empire he could have built. He smiled to himself, realizing how much his life had changed without him even noticing. The next day he decided to do something he had long postponed. He returned to the cemetery where his parents were buried. He stopped before the simple headstones and remained silent for a few minutes, unhurried, just feeling their presence in some way. "You would be proud," he said softly, more to himself than to anyone else. He had never felt this need to account for himself before, but now he understood that his journey wasn't just about new beginnings. It was also about honoring those who came before. When he turned to leave, he felt his phone vibrate in his pocket. It was a message from Miguel asking if he would stop by the foundation in the afternoon. Paulo took a deep breath, looked one last time at the headstones, and smiled. "Yes, I'll be there," he replied, because, in the end, he already knew there was no other place he wanted to be. That afternoon, when Paulo arrived at the foundation, he was greeted by a scene that made him smile. Miguel was organizing a group of volunteers, while Rafael, sitting on a nearby bench, was explaining something to some younger children, pointing at a colorful poster about a new project of the institution. Further ahead, Lupita was animatedly discussing something with one of the coordinators, gesturing as if she knew exactly what she wanted. It was fascinating to observe how each of them had found their own way within what they had built together. Paulo felt genuine pride in realizing that he no longer needed to be at the center of everything. The foundation was growing because it now belonged to them. His role had changed, and that did not bother him. Instead, it gave him peace. Lupita noticed his presence first and came over, still holding some sheets of notes. "We need to talk about the next steps of the fundraising campaign," she said bluntly. Paulo smiled, crossing his arms. "I'm not the boss here anymore, remember?" She rolled her eyes and replied, laughing, "But you're still the guy with the best ideas." He laughed along, knowing that despite his formal departure from leadership, he would always be a part of it. As he walked to the impromptu meeting, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: lightness. He no longer carried the weight of impersonal decisions and cold strategies. Now, everything he did had real purpose, and that purpose no longer depended solely on him. They were ready to move forward, and finally, so was he. In the passing months, the Novo Amanhã Foundation solidified itself as a true beacon of hope for countless children and families. The initiatives led by Miguel, Lupita, and Rafael gained national attention, attracting media coverage and other organizations seeking to replicate their successful model. Paulo, though more removed from daily operations, remained a mentor and advisor, always available to offer his experience and support when needed. He observed with admiration the capacity of these three young people to innovate and expand the foundation's reach, bringing help and opportunities to places once forgotten by society. One sunny morning, during a commemorative event at the foundation, Paulo was surprised by an unexpected tribute. The children, together with the institution's staff, had prepared a special presentation in gratitude to him. On stage, Miguel delivered an emotional speech about the impact Paulo had on everyone present, not only as the founder, but as an example of transformation and dedication. Lupita and Rafael presented him with a commemorative plaque, symbolizing everyone's gratitude. With teary eyes, Paulo realized that although he had started that project with the intention of redeeming himself for past mistakes, what he had really built was an extended family, united by love and the will to make a difference. In that moment, he was certain that his legacy was secured in the hands of those he had once embraced and who now continued a mission far greater than any personal ambition. After the tribute, Paulo stepped away for a few moments, walking alone through the foundation's corridors. The noise of children playing in the distance, mixed with the conversations of volunteers and staff, creating a vibrant atmosphere, full of life. He stopped in front of a wall adorned with photos of the institution's significant moments. Among them, he recognized an old image of Lupita and Rafael, still children, in the hospital shortly after it all began. Beside it was a recent photo of the two, now grown up, smiling at the camera as if they had never known a day of suffering. Paulo lightly touched the frame and smiled. That transformation was concrete proof that every choice he had made in recent years had been worthwhile. At the end of the day, as he was saying his goodbyes, Miguel called him aside. "There's something I've wanted to ask you for a long time," he said with a curious sparkle in his eyes. "If Lupita had never come into that hospital that night, do you think things would have changed?" Paulo fell silent for a few moments, absorbing the question. It was impossible to say for sure. Perhaps he would have continued his life the same way, never realizing the emptiness that consumed him. Perhaps destiny would have found another way to show him the path. But one thing he knew, that barefoot, slight girl full of faith had been the trigger for it all. "I don't know, son," he replied, placing his hand on Miguel's shoulder. "But I'm glad I never had to find out." The two looked at each other for a moment, and without needing more words, went off together, knowing that regardless of the past, what truly mattered was what was still to come. The years passed, and the Novo Amanhã Foundation continued growing, transforming lives and creating new opportunities for those in need. Paulo, now in a more tranquil phase of life, observed everything with a serene gaze, knowing he had found his true purpose. Miguel, Lupita, and Rafael were no longer children. They had become determined young adults, each following their own path, but always united by the mission they shared. Miguel invested in expanding the foundation, seeking new partnerships and broadening the scope of projects. Lupita dedicated herself to direct contact with the children and teenagers being helped, becoming a role model for those who, like her, once needed someone to believe in them. Rafael, with his health stabilized, began studying medicine, determined to give back to the world the same help he once received. One afternoon, Paulo received an unexpected invitation to return to the place where it all began, the hospital where Miguel had spent months in a coma. The director wanted to honor him for his social work and to thank him for the partnership with the foundation. As he entered that building, a whirlwind of memories surged. Despair, impotence, the night Lupita appeared with her unwavering faith. But this time, he wasn't alone. Miguel, Lupita, and Rafael were by his side, smiling. When he reached the auditorium, he was greeted by doctors, nurses, and patients who had benefited from the foundation. As he stepped onto the stage, Paulo took a deep breath and looked at those people. He didn't need long speeches or grand explanations. He simply said, in a firm, full of conviction voice, "Faith moves mountains." And at that moment, he knew his journey was complete. After the tribute at the hospital, Paulo decided to take one last walk through its corridors before leaving. As he walked, he passed by the old room where Miguel had been, hospitalized for so many months. The door was open, and inside was another child, accompanied by his mother, holding his hand exactly as Paulo had held Miguel's at that time. Paulo's heart tightened as he realized how cyclical life was. Other families were now facing the same fear and uncertainty he had once felt, but this time he knew he could do something about it. The Novo Amanhã Foundation was there to ensure that no child would have to fight alone, that no family would be abandoned to its fate. He approached the mother, who was looking at her child with tired yet hopeful eyes. Without introducing himself as the foundation's founder, he simply said, "If you need something, there's a place that can help you." He handed her a foundation card and smiled. The woman, surprised, took the card and nodded, as if holding on to a silent promise. Paulo gave one last look at the sleeping boy, remembering Miguel in that same position, before moving on. He left the hospital with a different feeling from the one he had experienced years ago. The first time he had left shattered and lost. Now he left that place with the certainty that his story was no longer about losses or regrets, but about all that could still be built. In the days that followed the ceremony, Paulo realized that something inside him had changed definitively. That hospital, which had once symbolized the most difficult moment of his life, now represented a milestone of transformation. It was no longer a place of pain, but rather the starting point for everything he had built. With every visit to the foundation, he saw the real impact of what he had done. Children who once had no home now had somewhere to sleep, to study, to dream. He knew he could never erase the mistakes of the past, but he was certain that he had done something much greater. He had learned, and more than that, he had changed the course of his own history and the history of so many others. One evening, while having dinner with Miguel, Lupita and Rafael, he noticed something curious. They were laughing, talking about the foundation's future, about plans to expand projects, about the new volunteers arriving. There was no longer any weight, no pain, no shadow of the past that once loomed over them, only lightness. At some point, without him noticing, they had become a real family. Not a family of blood, but something even stronger. A family built by love, shared struggle, and the desire to make the world a better place. Paulo smiled as he took a bite, while Lupita animatedly discussed with Rafael what the next big project of the foundation should be. For the first time in years, he didn't feel the need to be in control. Just being there was enough. Time continued passing, and the Novo Amanhã Foundation became a symbol of hope and transformation. Paulo, once a man driven only by ambition and results, now found himself happy watching Miguel, Lupita, and Rafael take over the project with so much passion. They had their own ideas, new approaches, and an energy that he no longer possessed. And that was good. It meant he had fulfilled his mission. One day, while reviewing some foundation reports in his office, he received an unexpected email. It was from a young woman who had been taken in years earlier. In the text, she recounted how her life had changed thanks to the foundation, how she was now studying at a university, and how she always remembered the words she heard in her first week there. "Here, you will never be alone." Paulo felt a lump in his throat reading that. His work, his legacy, was alive in each of those young people. That same afternoon, he walked through the foundation's corridors, noticing every detail. The walls decorated with drawings made by the children, the classrooms filled with laughter, the gardens where small groups played and talked. It was hard to believe that all of this had begun with one night of despair at the hospital, a night that changed everything. He found Lupita, sitting at a table, typing something with concentration. When she saw him, she smiled and raised an eyebrow. "Are you inspecting what we built, boss?" Paulo laughed. crossing his arms. "I'm just admiring. You all did a great job." She leaned forward, resting her chin on her hands. "We did." And in that moment, Paulo knew he would never have to fear the future. Everything he had started was now in the right hands. One afternoon, as he was returning home after a day at the foundation, Paulo found Miguel waiting for him on the veranda. His son, now a young adult, carried in his eyes the same curiosity and restlessness he had as a child, but with a maturity that Paulo increasingly admired. "I need to talk to you," said Miguel, motioning to the chair beside him. Paulo sat down unhurriedly, feeling that this was one of those important moments that couldn't be resolved in a few words. Miguel took a deep breath before continuing. "I'm thinking about traveling for a while. I want to visit other foundations around the world, learn from different projects, and bring new ideas to what we're building here." Paulo's heart tightened, but he smiled. "I knew this day would come," he replied with a surprising calm, even for himself. Miguel smiled back, relieved. "Do you think I'm doing the right thing?" Paulo looked at him for a moment, recalling the first time he held his hand in that hospital bed, afraid of losing him. Now, Miguel was there, strong, determined, ready to broaden his horizons. "Son, the right thing is always to follow what makes your heart beat faster, and I know yours is beating for this." Miguel nodded, moved. They fell silent for a few moments, simply listening to the gentle afternoon breeze. "But promise you'll always come back," added Paulo, and Miguel laughed. "Always." There was no farewell at that moment, just a new beginning. Paulo knew his son was ready to soar, and for the first time, instead of fear, he felt pride. Months went by, and as promised, Miguel embarked on his journey around the world. He sent frequent news, shared photos of inspiring places, and told stories about the amazing people he met at every new foundation he visited. Paulo followed everything with pride, but also with that silent nostalgia only parents understand. Rafael continued his studies in medicine, growing more passionate by the day about repaying the world for what he had once received. And Lupita, now officially one of the foundation's directors, worked tirelessly to expand the project's impact. Paulo, for his part, gradually reduced his involvement in management, allowing the new generation to take the reins. He knew that the foundation was safe in their hands. Now, his role was different. On one quiet afternoon, while observing some children playing in the foundation's gardens, he felt a light touch on his shoulder. It was Lupita, holding an envelope. "We received this today," she said, handing him the letter. Paulo opened it and found a handwritten message. It was from a young girl named Camila, one of the first children taken in by the foundation years ago. In the message, she thanked him for everything and said that she now worked as a teacher, helping vulnerable children. "You changed my life," the letter ended. Paulo read those words several times, feeling an indescribable warmth in his chest. He looked at Lupita, who smiled. "And you still think you didn't do enough?" she asked teasingly. Paulo chuckled softly, and for the first time, felt no need to respond. He already knew the answer. The days passed naturally, and Paulo began to allow himself moments of rest that he had never imagined possible before. His routine was now simple, but full of meaning. He enjoyed walking through the foundation without haste, talking with the children, listening to their stories, and sharing experiences. Many of them still arrived frightened, suspicious, like Lupita and Rafael had once been. But over time, they learned that here was a safe space where they could start over. And Paulo knew that this was his greatest victory. Not the buildings, not the partnerships or impressive numbers, but every child who returned to smiling. Those expressions of relief and happiness were the true measure of his success. One night, while sitting on his home's veranda, he received an unexpected call from Miguel. "Dad, I'm coming home," he said enthusiastically. Paulo felt a smile form automatically on his lips. "So, did you learn a lot out there?" Miguel laughed. "More than I ever imagined, But there's one thing I learned on the very first day. No matter where I go, this will always be my home." Paulo closed his eyes for a moment, absorbing those words. "And there will always be a place here waiting for you," he replied. When he hung up, he spent a while looking at the sky, watching the stars shine brightly. At that moment, he realized that everything was exactly where it should be. He, Miguel, Lupita, Rafael, the foundation, everything made sense. And for the first time in a long time, Paulo didn't feel the need to plan the next step. He simply savored that instant, knowing he had found what he had always sought, peace. The next day, Paulo arrived early at the foundation. The event was a celebration for the new training programs for young people, a project that Miguel and Lupita had been developing for months. The auditorium was full of volunteers, children, and partners supporting the initiative. Paulo walked through the space, greeting everyone, noticing every detail. It was no longer him organizing everything, but that didn't bother him. On the contrary, he felt proud to see that the foundation had a life of its own, growing and strengthening without depending on him. On stage, Miguel began the ceremony with an inspiring speech, talking about how everything started and the impact they were having. Next to him, Lupita and Rafael listened attentively, ready to speak when it was their turn. Paulo, seated in the first row, simply observed, absorbing that moment as a privileged spectator of his own history. When the event ended, Lupita approached him with a smile on her face. "Are you satisfied, boss?" she asked, crossing her arms. Paulo laughed. "More than that, I'm happy." Lupita nodded, seeming satisfied with the answer. She looked around and sighed, as if also absorbing it all. "You know, sometimes I think about how different everything would have been if I hadn't come into that hospital that night." Paulo looked at her fondly. "And I think about how different everything would have been if I hadn't listened to you." Lupita laughed softly and shook her head. "In the end, I think everyone ended up exactly where they should be." Paulo agreed, looking at Miguel and Rafael in the distance, laughing with some children. Yes, everyone was where they should be, and that was all that mattered. Later that same night, Paulo returned home feeling a different kind of tiredness. It wasn't exhaustion or that mental fatigue from solving business problems all day. It was a good tiredness from having lived a day full of meaning. He made a coffee, sat on the veranda, and watched the starry sky. He remembered the first conversation he had with Lupita about how the stars shine brighter for those who find their way. For years, he had searched for answers in the wrong places, thinking that success was measured in numbers and influence. Now he understood that his true wealth wasn't in the millions he had accumulated, but in the lives he had touched, and that by itself was more valuable than any empire. While finishing his coffee, he received a new message from Miguel. "Tomorrow we're going to visit a new foundation unit. You're coming, right?" Paulo smiled, already knowing his answer. He picked up his phone and typed, "Of course, where else would I be?" And, for the first time in a long time, he felt no doubt inside him. His journey hadn't been about finding redemption, but about finding purpose. And now, more than ever, he knew he would never have to search again. He closed his eyes for a moment, took a deep breath, and felt an indescribable peace take over him. The past no longer haunted him. The future didn't worry him. He was exactly where he was meant to be. The next morning, Paulo met Miguel, Lupita, and Rafael at the foundation's entrance. The sun shone brightly, illuminating the building that years ago was only a distant dream. Now it was a solid reality, a place that harbored hope, transformation, and new beginnings. They entered together, greeting volunteers and children along the way, and proceeded to the car that would take them to visit the new unit. On the way, Miguel explained the details of the project. Lupita added ideas, and Rafael, ever practical, already thought of ways to optimize the medical care at the site. Paulo just listened, smiling, absorbing every word. He liked the feeling of being part of it without having to lead. They were ready, and so was he. When they arrived at the new foundation space, Paulo felt a shiver run down his spine. It was a modest building, but with enough structure to shelter and educate more children. He saw the freshly painted walls, the empty rooms waiting to be filled with stories, and suddenly everything made sense again. "Could you say a few words for the team?" asked Miguel, noticing Paulo's expression. He thought for a moment and then smiled. "Not today. Today I just want to watch." Lupita laughed. Rafael patted his shoulder, and Miguel nodded, understanding what that meant. Paulo no longer needed to be the protagonist. The story would continue with them, and that, more than anything else, was the greatest proof that he had done everything right. After visiting the new foundation unit, Paulo decided to take one last walk alone around the place before heading home. He observed every detail, every empty space, imagining all the stories that would be written there in the years to come. He heard in the distance the voices of Miguel, Lupita, and Rafael discussing the next steps, and that brought him an indescribable comfort. The cycle had closed. He had begun this journey believing he needed to fix the past, but he realized that the most important thing was building the future. And now that future no longer depended on him. It was simply part of it, naturally and truly. As he left the building, he looked up at the sky and saw the stars beginning to appear, shining with an intensity that couldn't be ignored. He smiled, remembering Lupita's words from so many years ago. "The stars shine brighter for those who find their way." Yes, they shone brighter than ever. And Paulo Montiel, the man who once believed he could control everything, finally understood that he never needed power, money, or influence to be truly great. He just needed to be where he always belonged. And now he was. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more touching stories, and remember to turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new video.